Hi, I'm Christian. 2 weeks ago, my entire family sat in stunned silence in that mahogany-paneled law office, faces drained of color, hands trembling like they'd just witnessed the impossible. But just 3 months before that, my older brother Jorven had banned me from our father's 70th birthday celebration. "You're an embarrassment," he said. "A complete failure who makes our family look pathetic." My mother nodded along, agreeing I didn't deserve to sit at the same table as their successful son. They thought they'd buried my worth quietly, that I'd stay invisible while Jorven inherited our father's empire. But what they didn't know was that Dad had been watching everything. Every cruel word, every dismissal, every time they treated me like I didn't matter. So what changed in those 3 months? What truth made their confidence crumble into absolute panic? Well, let's just say it started with one final insult and ended with the most shocking will reading in our town's history, $50 million, and my brother discovering that being the favorite meant absolutely nothing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It started like most Tuesdays in Millbrook Heights, quiet. The kind of quiet that fools you into thinking life has finally found its rhythm. I was sorting through estimates for a kitchen renovation job in my cramped studio apartment, coffee growing cold beside a stack of invoices that reminded me just how tight things had gotten. The morning sun filtered through blinds that had seen better days, casting long shadows across my makeshift office setup. Then my phone buzzed. Mom. I stared at her contact photo for longer than necessary. We hadn't spoken since Easter dinner 3 months ago, when she'd made it crystal clear where I stood in the family hierarchy. The last conversation had ended with her sighing deeply and saying, "Christian, when are you going to stop embarrassing us and get a real job?" I picked up on the fourth ring. "Hi, Mom." "Christian, sweetheart." Her voice had that practiced sweetness she reserved for uncomfortable conversations. "I hope you're not too busy with your little projects." Little projects. Even now, she couldn't help herself. "What's up, Mom?" A pause. Too long, too calculated. "Well, I'm calling because there's been a development with your father." My chest tightened. Dad had been battling heart issues for months, but we'd all convinced ourselves he was getting better. The treatments were working. He was strong. He was only 71. "Is he okay?" Another pause. This one felt different. Final. "He passed away yesterday morning, Christian, peacefully, in his sleep." The words hit like cold water. I sat down hard on my desk chair, the stack of estimates scattering to the floor. "Yesterday? Why didn't anyone call me sooner?" "Well, honey, we've been handling arrangements. Jorven's been coordinating everything with the funeral home, and there's so much to organize. The business, the estate, all those complicated legal matters you wouldn't understand anyway." There it was. The casual dismissal wrapped in maternal concern. Even in death, Dad's empire was too complex for the family failure to comprehend. "When's the funeral?" "Tomorrow at 2, Brookside Memorial Chapel. But Christian, before you make any plans, we need to discuss something important." I waited, already knowing I wouldn't like what came next. "The family attorney, Valentino Kemp, insists on reading the will immediately after the service. Apparently your father made some very specific requests about timing. Jorven thinks it's unnecessary drama, but Mr. Kemp was quite firm." My mother's tone suggested this was somehow my fault, as if Dad's final wishes were another one of my inconvenient disruptions to their perfectly ordered world. "Of course I'll be there, Mom. He was my father too." Silence stretched between us, filled with years of unspoken resentment and disappointment. "Yes, well, just remember, this is a difficult time for all of us. Jorven's been running Draymont Construction for the past 5 years, handling all the real responsibilities while your father dealt with his health. This transition affects him most of all." The implication was clear. I was expected to play the supporting role I'd always played. Show up, stay quiet, let the important people handle important things. "I'll see you tomorrow," I said, and hung up before she could deliver another lecture about my place in the family order. I sat in the silence of my studio apartment, surrounded by the evidence of my little projects. Hand-drawn renovation plans for Mrs. Callista's bathroom remodel. Photos of the deck I'd built for the Norwin family last summer. Thank you cards from satisfied customers who appreciated my attention to detail and fair prices. None of it mattered to my family. To them, I was still the son who dropped out of business school to learn carpentry. The one who chose tools over ties, who preferred building with his hands rather than managing from an office. The disappointment who'd never amount to anything significant. Dad's death felt surreal. Not just because he was gone, but because even in grief, my family's first instinct was to minimize my role, to handle the important matters without the family embarrassment getting in the way. I thought about the last time I'd seen him, about 6 weeks ago when I dropped by the house to fix a loose railing on their front porch. Mom had made her usual comments about my appearance, work clothes, calloused hands, the truck with my business name painted on the side, Christian's Custom Carpentry. She'd suggested I park around back so the neighbors wouldn't see. But Dad had watched me work that day, really watched. He'd asked questions about the repair technique, complimented the precision of my measurements. When I finished, he'd run his hand along the smooth wood and nodded approvingly. "Quality work," he'd said quietly. "You've got good instincts, son." It was the first genuine compliment I'd received from him in years, and I'd treasured it. But now he was gone, and I was left wondering if those moments of connection had been real or just wishful thinking on my part. The apartment felt smaller suddenly, cramped with the weight of accumulated rejection and loss. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the busy street below. People heading to jobs that mattered, lives that made sense, families that valued them. Tomorrow I'd sit in that chapel, surrounded by relatives who'd spent decades making it clear I didn't belong. I'd listen to eulogies about Dad's business acumen, his legacy, his success. Jorven would be the grieving heir, the responsible son stepping up to carry on the family tradition. And I'd be the footnote, the one who'd disappointed everyone by choosing a different path. But there was something else nagging at me, something about Mom's tone when she mentioned the will reading. The way she'd emphasized that Mr. Kemp had insisted on specific timing, that Jorven thought it was unnecessary. There had been an undercurrent of anxiety in her voice, masked but present. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. What did it matter? Dad's will would be exactly what everyone expected. Everything to Jorven, the successful son who'd earned his place at the head of Draymont Construction. Maybe a small inheritance for me, enough to cover my rent for a few months. A token gesture to avoid looking completely heartless. The phone rang again. This time it was Kaylin, my neighbor and closest friend, calling to check on a job we were supposed to start next week. "Hey man, how's it going with the Morrison project? I've got the materials lined up for Thursday if you're still good to go." I'd forgotten about the Morrison project entirely, a complete bathroom renovation that would take 2 weeks and pay enough to cover my expenses for the next month. "Actually, Kaylin, I need to postpone. My father passed away yesterday, funeral's tomorrow." The line went quiet for a moment. Kaylin knew about my family situation, had listened to me vent about their dismissive treatment more times than I could count. "Jesus, Christian, I'm sorry. You okay?" "Yeah, I think so. It's complicated." "It always is with family. You need anything? Want me to come with you tomorrow?" I almost said yes. The idea of having someone in that chapel who actually respected me was appealing. But this was family business, no matter how dysfunctional. "Thanks, but I need to handle this alone. Can you call the Morrisons and explain? Tell them we'll start the following Monday." "Already on it. And Christian? Don't let them make you feel small tomorrow. I've seen your work. You're twice the man your brother will ever be." After we hung up, I sat back down at my desk and tried to focus on paperwork, but my mind kept wandering to tomorrow. The funeral, the will reading, the inevitable moment when Jorven would officially inherit everything Dad had built. I'd made peace with that reality years ago, or thought I had. Jorven was the business major, the one who'd worked his way up through the company ranks, who understood profit margins and market strategies. He'd earned his position through years of dedication to Dad's vision. But as the evening wore on, I found myself thinking about those conversations I'd had with Dad over the years. The ones where he'd ask about my business, shown genuine interest in my projects. The time he'd quietly recommended me to his friend Nelson for a major renovation job. The way he'd defended my choice to leave college when Mom had been particularly brutal about my wasted potential. Maybe there had been more understanding between us than I'd realized. Maybe he'd seen value in what I was doing, even if he'd never said so directly. Or maybe I was just creating false hope to ease the sting of tomorrow's inevitable disappointment. I spent the rest of the evening cleaning my apartment, organizing my tools, preparing for whatever came next. Tomorrow would bring closure to one chapter of my life and likely confirm everything my family had always believed about my limited worth. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But something deep in my chest whispered that this story wasn't over yet. The morning of Dad's funeral arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that seems designed for endings. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, adjusting the tie I'd bought specifically for this occasion. The navy blue suit was borrowed from Kaylin, who was roughly my size but clearly had better taste in formal wear. My reflection looked foreign to me. Clean-shaven, hair combed back, no trace of sawdust or paint stains on my hands. I looked like someone trying to impersonate a successful person, which wasn't far from the truth. The drive to Brookside Memorial Chapel took 25 minutes through the wealthy part of town where I'd grown up but no longer belonged. Grand homes with manicured lawns and circular driveways. The kind of neighborhood where appearances mattered more than substance. Where success was measured by the size of your house and the brand of your car. I pulled my work truck into the chapel parking lot, immediately regretting the choice. Jorven's black BMW sat near the entrance, flanked by similar luxury vehicles I recognized as belonging to various relatives and family friends. My truck, with its dented tailgate and faded paint, looked like it had wandered into the wrong zip code. Inside the chapel, the atmosphere was hushed and reverent. Flower arrangements filled the space with an overwhelming sweetness that couldn't quite mask the underlying scent of grief and expensive perfume. About 200 people had come to pay their respects to Draymont Construction's founding patriarch. I spotted my family in the front row. Mom wore a black dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Jorven sat beside her in a perfectly tailored suit, accepting condolences with the practiced grace of someone born to command respect. He looked every inch the successful businessman. Broad shoulders, confident posture, silver-touched temples that added distinguished authority to his 43 years. The golden son who'd never doubted his place in the world. I took a seat in the third row, close enough to be family but far enough back to avoid disrupting the main show. Several relatives nodded politely in my direction, the kind of acknowledgement you'd give to a distant acquaintance, whose name you couldn't quite remember. The service was exactly what I'd expected, elegant, dignified, and focused almost entirely on Dad's business achievements. Speaker after speaker praised his vision, his leadership, his ability to build Draymont Construction into one of the region's most respected development companies. Jorven delivered the main eulogy, his voice steady and authoritative, as he spoke about carrying on Dad's legacy. He painted a picture of a man who'd built something lasting, something worthy of respect and admiration. The grieving son stepping seamlessly into his destined role. I listened to it all with a growing sense of disconnection. The man they were describing was definitely my father, but it was only one dimension of him. They spoke of his business acumen, but not his dry sense of humor. They praised his professional success, but said nothing about how he'd taught me to identify different types of wood by their grain patterns when I was 12. When Jorven mentioned how Dad had always known the importance of leaving the business in capable hands, his eyes found mine in the crowd. The message was clear. This transition had been planned, expected, approved by the man we were mourning. After the service, I joined the slow procession to Millbrook Heights Cemetery. The burial was brief, formal, with words about eternal rest and joining loved ones who'd gone before. I watched as they lowered Dad's casket into the ground and wondered if he'd known how differently his two sons would remember him. The reception at Grandstone Country Club was the kind of gathering my family excelled at. Tasteful catering, hushed conversations about business and golf, everyone dressed like they were auditioning for a catalog shoot. I nursed a single drink and tried to blend into the background while relatives shared memories of Dad's various triumphs. My Aunt Saphira approached me during a lull in the conversation. She'd always been kinder than the rest of the family, less concerned with maintaining perfect appearances. "Christian, how are you holding up?" "I'm okay, Aunt Saphira. It's been a difficult day." She glanced around the room, then lowered her voice. "You know, your father talked about you more than you might think. He was proud of what you'd built with your business." I felt a flicker of warmth at her words, but before I could respond, Jorven materialized beside us with his practiced smile. Aunt Sapphira, thank you so much for coming today. Dad would have been touched by the turnout. She squeezed my arm gently before turning to embrace Jorven. Of course, dear. He was so proud of both his boys. Absolutely. Jorven agreed, but his tone suggested the conversation was over. Christian, we should probably head over to Mr. Kemp's office soon. The will reading is scheduled for 4 o'clock. I checked my watch. 3:30. Time for the final act of this carefully orchestrated drama. I'll meet you there, I said, not trusting myself to ride in the same car with Jorven and Mom while they discussed their expectations for the afternoon. Valentino Kemp's law office occupied the top floor of the Meridian building, all glass and granite with a view that showcased the city's skyline. The kind of place that charged by the hour and made sure you knew it. I arrived to find the family already assembled in a conference room that looked like it belonged in a movie about important people making important decisions. Mom sat rigidly in a leather chair, her composure finally showing cracks after the long day. Jorven paced near the window, checking his phone with the distracted air of someone managing multiple crises. Mr. Kemp was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with the kind of quietly expensive appearance that suggested success without flashiness. He'd handled Dad's legal affairs for over a decade, which meant he knew exactly where all the bodies were buried. Thank you all for coming, he began, settling behind his desk with a thick folder. I know this has been an extremely difficult day, and I'll do my best to make this process as straightforward as possible. He opened the folder and withdrew a document that looked substantial enough to run a small country. Your father was very specific about his wishes, and he updated this will as recently as 6 weeks ago. Before I begin reading, I want to emphasize that these decisions were made with considerable thought and planning. 6 weeks ago. That was right around the time I'd fixed their front porch railing. The will contains several bequests to charitable organizations and a few specific gifts to longtime employees of Draymont Construction. But the primary focus, naturally, is on the distribution of the estate to family members. Jorven stopped pacing, his attention now fully focused on Mr. Kemp. Mom straightened in her chair, preparing to hear the words that would officially transfer Dad's empire to her firstborn son. The total value of the estate, including business assets, real estate holdings, and liquid investments, is approximately $52 million. Even expecting a substantial sum, the number hit like a physical blow. $52 million. More money than I could have imagined, representing decades of Dad's hard work and careful planning. To my wife, Maeva Draymont, I leave the family home and its contents, along with $2 million to ensure her comfort and security for the remainder of her life. Mom nodded, accepting this provision as appropriate and expected. To various charitable organizations and long-term employees, I leave gifts totaling approximately $1 million. That left $49 million unaccounted for. The bulk of Dad's empire, including Draymont Construction itself, Jorven's inheritance, the reward for 30 years of being the perfect son. Mr. Kemp paused, glancing at each of us before continuing. Something in his expression had changed, a careful neutrality that suggested we were approaching the heart of the matter. To my son, Jorven Draymont, I leave the sum of $1. The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. $1. I was certain I'd misheard, that Mr. Kemp had misspoken or skipped a page. Jorven went completely still. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? To my son, Jorven Draymont, I leave the sum of $1. Mom half rose from her chair. That can't be right. There must be some mistake. Mr. Kemp's expression remained carefully professional. There is no mistake, Mrs. Draymont. Your husband was very clear about this provision. Would you like me to continue? The room had gone silent except for the sound of Mom's shallow breathing and the distant hum of traffic far below. Jorven looked like someone had reached into his chest and removed something vital. Please continue, he said quietly. To my son, Christian Draymont, I leave the remainder of my estate, including all business assets, real property, investments, and liquid assets. The total value is approximately $49 million. The words didn't make sense. They couldn't make sense. I was the disappointment, the failure, the son who'd never amounted to anything. Jorven was the heir, the one who'd earned Dad's respect and trust. This is insane, Jorven's voice was barely controlled. Our father was clearly not in his right mind when he made these changes. No one leaves an empire to someone who doesn't understand the first thing about business. Mr. Kemp opened another folder. Actually, your father anticipated there might be questions about his mental capacity. He underwent a comprehensive psychological evaluation just 5 weeks ago. The results confirm he was of sound mind and fully competent to make these decisions. He slid copies of the evaluation across the desk. Official letterhead, multiple signatures, the kind of documentation that would hold up in any court. Furthermore, he left detailed instructions about his reasoning, which I am authorized to share if the family wishes. Mom was staring at me like I'd personally orchestrated Dad's death. What did you do? What lies did you tell him? I didn't do anything, I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. I had no idea about any of this. And I hadn't. Not the slightest hint that Dad was planning something this dramatic, this devastating to the family order we'd all accepted as permanent. Jorven had moved to the window, his hands pressed against the glass as if he needed the support to remain standing. Read the reasoning, he said without turning around. I want to know why our father decided to destroy everything we've built. Mr. Kemp hesitated for a moment, then withdrew another document from the folder. These are your father's words, recorded during our final meeting. For 30 years, I watched my elder son become everything I thought I wanted in an heir. Ambitious, polished, successful by every conventional measure, but I also watched him become someone who values image over substance, who treats people as disposable if they don't serve his immediate needs. The words hit Jorven like physical blows. He turned from the window, his face pale but his eyes blazing with anger. My younger son chose a different path, Mr. Kemp continued reading. One that his family consistently dismissed as beneath their standards. But in choosing that path, he became someone I'm proud to call my son. Someone who builds with integrity, who treats every person with respect regardless of their social status, who understands that true success isn't measured by the size of your office or the price of your car. Mom was shaking her head slowly, as if physical motion could somehow change the reality of what she was hearing. Christian has spent years believing his family saw no value in his choices, the letter continued. But I saw everything. I saw how he treated the workers on our job sites with dignity, when Jorven saw them as obstacles. I saw how he built relationships with clients based on trust rather than manipulation. I saw someone who inherited the best parts of what I tried to build, even though he chose to build it differently. The room was completely silent now except for the sound of paper rustling as Mr. Kemp turned to the final page. I'm leaving Draymont Construction to Christian not because he's perfect, but because he's proven he can build something meaningful without losing his soul in the process. Jorven will inherit exactly what he's always valued most, the appearance of success. $1 should be sufficient for that. Mr. Kemp set the letter down and looked at each of us in turn. There are additional provisions regarding the transition of business operations, but those can be discussed at a later time. For now, I think everyone needs time to process this information. Time to process. As if this was the kind of shock you could digest with enough contemplation. I was now worth $49 million. Owner of a construction empire I'd never wanted or expected. The family failure had just inherited everything the family success had spent his life working toward. And judging by the way Jorven was looking at me, this was only the beginning of the battle. The silence in that conference room stretched until it became unbearable. Mom sat frozen in her chair, staring at the wall behind Mr. Kemp's desk as if the wood paneling might suddenly reveal this was all an elaborate mistake. Jorven hadn't moved from the window, his reflection ghost-like against the darkening sky. I was the first to speak, my voice barely above a whisper. I need some air. Mr. Kemp nodded understandingly. Of course. Christian, when you're ready, we'll need to schedule several meetings to discuss the transition process. There are numerous legal and financial matters to address. Transition process? Jorven's voice cut through the room like broken glass. We're really going to pretend this makes sense? That our father, in his right mind, would leave a $50 million company to someone who's never managed anything more complex than a bathroom renovation? I felt heat rise in my chest, but before I could respond, Mr. Kemp intervened. Mr. Draymont, I understand this is shocking, but your father's wishes were very clear. The psychological evaluation confirms he was completely competent when he made these decisions. Competent, Jorven spat. Right. So competent that he decided to hand over decades of work to someone who dropped out of business school to play with power tools. Jorven. Mom's voice was sharp, but I couldn't tell if she was warning him to stop or encouraging him to continue. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling unsteady. I think I should go." "Oh no." Jorven turned from the window, his face twisted with an anger I'd never seen before. "You don't get to drop this bomb and then disappear. You want to explain to me how this happened? How you convinced our dying father to disinherit his own son?" "I didn't convince him of anything. I had no idea." "Bullshit!" The word exploded from him with startling violence. "You think I don't know about your little visits? Your conversations about his legacy and how the business should be run? You've been poisoning him against me for months." The accusation was so far from reality that I almost laughed. "Poisoning him? Jorven, I've barely spoken to Dad in the past year. Every time I came around, you made it clear I wasn't welcome. Because you don't belong in our world." His voice rose to a shout. "You never did. Dad built something important, something that matters, and you chose to walk away from it to become a glorified handyman." The contempt in his voice was like acid. Years of accumulated dismissal and resentment poured out in a torrent of barely controlled rage. Mom finally found her voice. "Christian, you have to understand how this looks. Jorven has dedicated his entire adult life to Draymond Construction. He's worked 18-hour days, sacrificed his personal relationships, turned down opportunities with other companies because he believed he was building something for his family's future." "And what did I sacrifice?" I asked quietly. "My entire relationship with this family, my father's approval, any sense that I belonged somewhere." "Oh, please." Jorven's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Poor Christian, the misunderstood artist. Do you have any idea what it's like to carry the weight of everyone's expectations? To know that every decision you make affects dozens of employees and their families? To have your worth measured by quarterly reports and profit margins? Do you have any idea what it's like to have your worth measured by nothing at all?" The words came out harder than I'd intended. To be treated like a disappointment from the moment you choose your own path? "Your own path," he repeated mockingly. "You mean running away from responsibility, taking the easy route, building decks and fixing toilets instead of dealing with real challenges." Something inside me snapped. 35 years of swallowing insults, of accepting my place as the family failure, of watching Jorven receive credit and respect for simply existing in the right space at the right time. "Real challenges?" I stood up fully now, meeting his gaze directly. "You want to talk about real challenges? I built my business from nothing. No family connections, no inherited client list, no safety net if I failed. Every job I've ever gotten, I earned through my own work and reputation." "Your reputation," Jorven scoffed, "in the exciting world of bathroom renovations." "Yes, bathroom renovations, and kitchen remodels, and deck installations, and custom furniture. Work that requires skill, creativity, and the ability to solve problems with your hands, instead of just delegating them to other people." Mr. Kemp cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should schedule individual meetings." "No," Jorven cut him off. "Let's get this all out in the open. Christian, since you're apparently the new head of Draymond Construction, why don't you tell us your vision for the company, your plans for our current projects, your strategy for managing our relationships with contractors and suppliers?" The challenge hung in the air between us. He was right, of course. I didn't know the first thing about running a major construction company. I'd never managed more than 2 employees at a time, never dealt with million-dollar budgets or complex commercial projects. But something in his tone, the absolute certainty that I would crumble under questioning, triggered a defiance I didn't know I possessed. "You want to know my vision?" I said quietly. "How about treating workers like human beings instead of disposable resources? How about building relationships based on trust instead of fear? How about remembering that construction is supposed to be about creating something meaningful, not just maximizing profit margins?" Jorven's face flushed red. That's exactly the kind of naive bullshit I'd expect from someone who's never had real responsibility. "You think business is some kind of feel-good fantasy where everyone holds hands and sings songs? I think business should have some connection to basic human decency." "Decency?" He laughed again, the sound sharp and ugly. "You want to lecture me about decency? You've just stolen everything I've worked for my entire life, and you want to talk about decency? I didn't steal anything. Dad made this choice. Dad made this choice because you manipulated him, because you played the victim card one too many times and he fell for it." The accusation hit me like a physical blow, partly because there was a tiny voice in my head wondering if it might be true. Had I somehow influenced Dad's decision without realizing it? Had my complaints about feeling excluded somehow poisoned his perception of Jorven? Mom spoke up again, her voice strained. "Christian, you have to see how impossible this situation is. Jorven has clients expecting continuity, employees depending on stable leadership. You can't just walk into a complex business and expect to understand it overnight." "Maybe not," I admitted, but apparently Dad thought I could learn. "Dad was sick," Jorven said flatly. "Sick and old and probably medicated half the time. This will is the product of a confused mind, and any reasonable court will see that." Mr. Kemp's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Mr. Draymond, I need to remind you that your father underwent extensive psychological evaluation specifically to prevent those kinds of challenges. Multiple independent doctors confirmed his mental competency. Then, he was coerced, manipulated. There has to be some explanation for why a rational man would destroy his own legacy." "His legacy," I repeated. "Is that what you think this is about? Destroying something? What else could it be? You've never shown the slightest interest in Draymond Construction. You've spent years making it clear that you think what we do is beneath you, that we're all shallow and materialistic for caring about success. I never said that. You didn't have to say it. It was written all over your face every time you came to a family dinner. The judgmental look, the way you'd change the subject whenever we talked about business. You made it clear you thought you were better than us." The accusation was so opposite to my actual feelings that I struggled to find words. "Better than you? Jorven, I've spent my entire adult life believing I wasn't good enough for this family. That I was the disappointment, the failure, the one who didn't measure up. And now you get to prove it by running Dad's company into the ground." The cruelty of the statement took my breath away. This wasn't just anger about inheritance. This was years of accumulated contempt finally being expressed without restraint. "You know what?" I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "Maybe I will run it into the ground. Maybe I'll destroy everything Dad built, just like you expect. Or maybe I'll discover that there's more than one way to define success." Jorven stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "If you think I'm going to stand by and watch you destroy 30 years of work, you're mistaken. This isn't over, Christian, not by a long shot." The threat was unmistakable, but instead of intimidating me, it crystallized something that had been building throughout this entire confrontation. For the first time in my life, I wasn't backing down from my brother's anger. "You're right," I said. "It's not over. But for the first time, it's not automatically your game to win." I turned to Mr. Kemp. "When can we schedule those transition meetings?" "I'll have my secretary call you tomorrow to set up appointments." "Good." I looked back at Jorven and Mom, both staring at me with expressions I'd never seen before. Not dismissal or condescension, but something closer to shock. I guess I have a lot to learn about running a construction company. I walked toward the door, my legs more steady than they'd been since this nightmare began. Behind me I heard Mom's voice, shaky and desperate. "Christian, wait. We need to discuss this as a family. There has to be some way to work this out." I paused with my hand on the doorknob. 35 years, Mom. 35 years of making it clear that I didn't belong in this family's important conversations. I think I've done enough waiting. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, leaving behind the only family I'd ever known and walking towards something I couldn't yet understand or define. But for the first time in my life, I was walking toward it as the person with the power to decide what came next. The next morning hit me like a freight train made of legal documents and financial statements. Mr. Kemp's office had delivered 3 boxes of paperwork to my apartment before 9 a.m., along with a note explaining that these were essential documents for initial review. The boxes currently sat on my small dining table like monuments to a life I'd never imagined living. I'd barely slept, my mind churning through the events of yesterday's will reading. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jorven's face when Mr. Kemp announced the $1 inheritance. The shock, the rage, the absolute disbelief that his carefully constructed world had collapsed in a matter of minutes. My phone had been ringing since 6 a.m. Reporters somehow already knew about the will reading, probably tipped off by someone at the funeral. I'd stopped answering after the 5th call, requesting an interview about my, quote, unexpected inheritance and plans for Draymond Construction's future. I was attempting to make sense of a financial statement that might as well have been written in ancient Greek when someone knocked on my door. Not the polite tap of a neighbor or delivery person, but the firm, authoritative knock of someone who expected to be answered immediately. Through the peephole, I saw Jorven standing in the hallway, still wearing yesterday's funeral clothes but looking like he'd slept in his car. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he'd had an even worse night than mine. I opened the door. "Jorven, we need to talk." He pushed past me into the apartment without waiting for an invitation, his eyes immediately taking in the boxes of documents scattered across my dining table. "Jesus, Christian, do you have any idea what you're looking at here? I'm beginning to get a picture." He moved to the table, picking up random papers with the familiarity of someone who'd spent years navigating corporate documentation. "This is the quarterly report for our commercial division. 14 active projects, total value of over $30 million. All depending on continuity of leadership and expertise." I watched him rifle through documents like he was looking for something specific. "What are you really here for, Jorven?" He set down the papers and turned to face me, his expression more controlled than it had been yesterday, but no less intense. "I'm here to offer you a solution that benefits everyone." "I'm listening." "Sell the company to me." The words hung in the air between us. "Sell it to you?" "Yes. For fair market value. $45 million, which is more than generous considering the complexities of the transition. You walk away with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life, and I continue running the business I've spent decades building." I sat down on my couch, trying to process the proposal. "Where would you get $45 million? "I have investors lined up. People who understand the value of what Draymont Construction represents, and who are concerned about what happens when leadership transitions to someone with no experience. Investors who were probably calling you before the will was even finished being read." His jaw tightened slightly. "The business community is small, Christian. Word travels fast when there are potential disruptions to major ongoing projects." I leaned back, studying my brother's face. There was something desperate beneath his controlled exterior, a franticness that suggested this wasn't just about wanting to run the company. "What aren't you telling me, Jorven? What do you mean? You could have made this offer yesterday in front of Mr. Kemp. Instead, you show up at my apartment at 9 in the morning looking like you haven't slept, pushing for an immediate decision. What's the rush?" He moved to the window, staring out at the street below. "There are complications you don't understand." "Such as?" A long pause. "The Meridian Plaza project." I vaguely remembered hearing about Meridian Plaza, a massive mixed-use development that had been in the planning stages for over a year. "What about it?" "It's our biggest contract ever, $200 million development, scheduled to break ground next month. The investors are already nervous about the ownership transition, and if they lose confidence in our leadership capabilities, they could pull out." "Exactly. And that wouldn't just hurt Draymont Construction, it would destroy us. We've leveraged significant resources on the assumption that this project would proceed as planned." I was beginning to understand the scope of what I'd inherited. This wasn't just a construction company. It was a complex web of contracts, obligations, and relationships that required constant management and expertise I simply didn't possess. "How leveraged?" Jorven returned to the table, pulling out a specific document from one of the boxes. "See this? Operating loans secured against future project revenues. We borrowed heavily to finance equipment and personnel for the Meridian Plaza timeline." The numbers on the page were staggering. Millions of dollars in loans, all predicated on the successful completion of projects that required expertise I'd never developed. If Meridian Plaza falls through, we default on these loans? Within 90 days. The picture was becoming clearer. Jorven wasn't just angry about losing his inheritance. He was terrified that my inexperience would trigger a cascade of financial disasters that would destroy everything Dad had built. "So your solution is for me to sell the company to you immediately, before anyone realizes how precarious the situation actually is." "My solution is to prevent a disaster that hurts everyone: employees, contractors, suppliers, clients. Hundreds of people whose livelihoods depend on Draymont Construction remaining stable." He wasn't wrong. The responsibility I'd inherited wasn't just about money or family dynamics. It was about real people with real jobs who depended on decisions I wasn't qualified to make. "What happens if I don't sell?" Jorven's expression darkened. "Then we find out together how much damage an inexperienced owner can do to a complex business." There was a threat embedded in his words, subtle but unmistakable. "Are you saying you'd sabotage the company if I don't sell?" "I'm saying that expertise matters, Christian. Relationships matter, trust matters. I've spent years building connections with the people who make these projects possible. Contractors who have worked with us for decades, suppliers who extend credit based on personal relationships, clients who choose us because they know what to expect. And those relationships are loyalty to you personally, not to Draymond Construction. In many cases, yes. The admission was staggering. Jorven was essentially telling me that the company's success depended on his personal network, and that network could be withdrawn if he chose to make that happen. So if I refuse to sell, you take your relationships and start a competing company? I take my relationships and do what's best for everyone involved, which might mean starting fresh with people who understand the business. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, needing distance to process what I was hearing. Jorven was offering me a choice: sell immediately and walk away rich, or fight for control of a company that might collapse without his cooperation. The investors who are ready to finance your purchase, I said, let me guess, the same people involved in the Meridian Plaza project? Silence. Jesus, Jorven, you're not just threatening to withdraw your support, you've already lined up the people who could kill the company's biggest contract. I'm trying to prevent a disaster, not create one. By holding a gun to the head of the business Dad left me. By recognizing reality. You're not qualified for this, Christian. You're a good carpenter, probably a decent small business owner, but you're not equipped to run a major construction company. And the longer we pretend otherwise, the more damage gets done. He was right about my qualifications, but there was something else in his desperation that bothered me. The speed with which he'd assembled investors, the immediate pressure for a decision, the convenient alignment of people who could either support or destroy the company's future. How long have you been planning this? What do you mean? The investors, the financial pressure, the convenient threat to the Meridian Plaza contract. How long have you been setting up a scenario where Dad's heir would be forced to sell to you immediately? Jorven's face went very still. I don't know what you're implying. I'm implying that maybe Dad's decision to leave you $1 wasn't as sudden or irrational as you want everyone to believe. Maybe he knew exactly what kind of person you'd become. The words hit their target. Jorven's carefully controlled facade cracked, revealing something ugly underneath. What kind of person I'd become? I became the kind of person who could run his business successfully. The kind of person who could navigate complex deals and manage difficult clients. The kind of person who could build something meaningful instead of hiding in a workshop making birdhouses. The kind of person who would threaten to destroy his father's legacy if he didn't get his way. I'm trying to save his legacy. By extorting the person he chose to inherit it. We stared at each other across the kitchen, years of accumulated resentment and competition finally reaching a boiling point. You have 24 hours to decide, Jorven said finally. After that, I can't guarantee what happens to the business relationships that keep Draymond Construction viable. And if I call your bluff? Then we both find out whether Dad was right to trust you with something this important. He moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Christian, I don't want to see you fail. But I won't let you take the company down with you. After he left, I sat in the silence of my apartment, surrounded by documents I barely understood, and facing a decision that would determine not just my future, but the futures of hundreds of people I'd never met. The smart play was obvious. Take the money and run. Walk away with $45 million, and let Jorven handle the complexities of running a business he understood better than I ever would. But something about his desperation, about the speed and coordination of his response to yesterday's will reading, suggested there was more to this story than he was telling me. I picked up my phone and dialed Mr. Kemp's office. Valentino Kemp's office, this is Thessa. This is Christian Draymond. I need to schedule an emergency meeting with Mr. Kemp today. Of course, Mr. Draymond. He has an opening at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Perfect. And Thessa, I need him to bring every document related to Dad's decision-making process for the will, everything. I'll make sure he has the complete file. After I hung up, I returned to the boxes of documents, but this time I wasn't trying to understand the business. I was looking for patterns, inconsistencies, anything that might explain why a successful businessman would suddenly decide to disinherit his heir apparent in favor of his disappointment son. Because if Jorven had been planning this response for weeks or months, if he'd been positioning himself to force a quick sale regardless of Dad's wishes, then maybe Dad's decision hadn't been about rewarding me. Maybe it had been about protecting something from the person everyone assumed would inherit it. The meeting with Mr. Kemp revealed exactly what I'd suspected and feared. Dad hadn't just been observing family dynamics. He'd been conducting his own investigation into Draymond Construction's financial management. The documents Kemp showed me painted a picture that made my blood run cold. "Your father first came to me about concerns regarding company finances 6 months ago," Kemp explained, spreading out bank statements and financial reports across his conference table. He'd noticed discrepancies that troubled him. The papers told a story of systematic fund diversion, nothing dramatic or obvious, but a pattern of expenses that didn't quite add up, payments to subcontractors that seemed inflated, consulting fees to companies that existed only on paper. How much are we talking about? Over the past 3 years, approximately $2.8 million. I stared at the numbers, trying to process what I was seeing. Jorven was stealing from the company? Your father's investigation suggested that money was being redirected through a network of shell companies, all ultimately controlled by your brother. The amounts were carefully calculated to avoid triggering automatic audits. This explained everything. Jorven's desperate need to regain control wasn't just about pride or family legacy. It was about covering up years of embezzlement. If I took over the company and conducted a proper audit, his theft would be exposed. Does he know that Dad discovered this? Your father never confronted him directly, but Jorven may have suspected something. The will change happened shortly after your father hired an independent forensic accountant to verify the findings. I felt sick. My inheritance wasn't a reward for being the better son. It was Dad's attempt to save his company from someone who'd been systematically looting it. What happens now? That depends on what you want to do with this information. Your father documented everything carefully, but he never filed criminal charges. He said he wanted to give you the choice of how to handle it. Even in death, Dad was putting an impossible burden on me. Expose my brother as a thief and destroy what remained of our family, or stay silent and become complicit in covering up his crimes. I was still processing this revelation when my phone rang. Jorven. Have you made your decision? I need more time to review the documents. Time is a luxury we don't have, Christian. I just got off the phone with Richard Vossen from Meridian Plaza. He's heard rumors about ownership instability and wants a face-to-face meeting tomorrow to discuss the future of the project. Richard Vossen was one of the city's most influential developers, and Meridian Plaza was his signature project. If he lost confidence in Draymond Construction, it would trigger exactly the kind of cascade failure Jorven had threatened. What did you tell him? That we'd have clarity about leadership within 24 hours, which means you need to make your decision tonight. The pressure was calculated and relentless. Jorven was orchestrating a crisis that would force me to sell before I could discover what he'd been hiding. I'll call you back in a few hours. Christian, don't make this more complicated than it needs to be. Take the money, walk away, and let me clean up this mess. Clean up the mess. Interesting choice of words from someone who'd created it in the first place. After hanging up, I turned back to Mr. Kemp. I need to ask you something confidential. If I wanted to conduct a complete audit of Draymond Construction's finances, how quickly could that happen? With the right forensic accounting firm, we could have preliminary results within a week. And if someone wanted to hide evidence of financial irregularities, what would they need to do? Kemp's expression grew thoughtful. They'd need access to the company's computer systems, physical documents, and banking records. Essentially, they'd need to maintain control of the business operations during any transition period. The picture was becoming crystal clear. Jorven's demand for an immediate sale wasn't just about preventing damage to the company. It was about maintaining control long enough to cover his tracks. One more question. If I decided to proceed with an audit, could that be done without alerting the current management? If you authorized it as the legal owner, yes, we could work with external firms to access records independently. I made my decision. I want to authorize a complete forensic audit, starting immediately, and I want it done without Jorven's knowledge. Are you sure? This could have significant legal and family implications. I'm sure. The next morning brought exactly the crisis Jorven had predicted. Richard Vossen's office called at 8 a.m., requesting an immediate meeting to discuss leadership continuity for the Meridian Plaza project. The implicit threat was clear. Convince me that Draymond Construction was still viable, or find a new general contractor. I agreed to meet with Vossen at his downtown office that afternoon, knowing I'd be walking into a conversation for which I was completely unprepared. But I had one advantage Jorven didn't know about. I now understood what he was really trying to protect. The meeting with Vossen was exactly as uncomfortable as I'd expected. His office occupied an entire floor of the Pinnacle Tower, with views that showcased the city's skyline and reminded visitors of his influence over that landscape. "Mr. Draymont," he said, shaking my hand with the practiced grip of someone who evaluated people instantly, "I'm sorry for your loss. Your father was a man of exceptional integrity." "Thank you. I have to be direct with you, Christian. The Meridian Plaza project represents a significant investment, and my partners are concerned about continuity of leadership at Draymont Construction." I'd rehearsed this conversation during the drive over, but sitting across from Vossen's mahogany desk, I felt every bit the inexperienced fraud Jorven had accused me of being. "I understand their concerns. Your brother has been our primary contact throughout the development process. He understands the complexities of the project and has established relationships with our entire team. To be frank, his continued involvement would go a long way toward maintaining confidence in this partnership." There it was. Vossen wasn't just threatening to pull the contract, he was actively advocating for Jorven's continued control of the company. "Mr. Vossen, can I ask how long you've known my brother?" "Personally? About 5 years. Professionally, since we began planning Meridian Plaza 18 months ago." "And in that time, have you had any concerns about Draymont Construction's financial management or business practices?" His expression shifted slightly. "What kind of concerns?" I decided to take a calculated risk. I am in the process of conducting a comprehensive audit of the company's finances, standard practice when assuming control of any business operation. Of course. And what does that audit involve? A complete review of all expenditures, contracts, and financial relationships over the past 3 years. Vossen's face remained neutral, but I caught something in his eyes. A flicker of concern, maybe even recognition. "That sounds very thorough." "It is. We're particularly interested in payments to subcontractors and consulting fees, making sure everything meets the highest standards of transparency." The silence stretched between us for several seconds. When Vossen spoke again, his tone had changed. "Christian, can I speak to you off the record?" "Of course." "There have been some irregularities in our payment processing that my accounting team flagged several months ago. Nothing major, but some invoices that seemed inconsistent with industry standards." My heart started racing. "What kind of irregularities?" "Charges for services that appeared to be marked up significantly beyond typical rates. When we questioned them, your brother explained they were necessary due to specialized requirements, but it never quite made sense to our people." This was it. Independent confirmation that Jorven's theft extended beyond just Draymont Construction's internal accounts. "Did you document these concerns?" "We noted them, yes. But your brother had explanations for everything, and we didn't want to jeopardize the project over accounting details." "Mr. Vossen, I'm going to be completely honest with you. I've discovered evidence that my brother has been systematically embezzling money from Draymont Construction for the past 3 years. The forensic audit I mentioned will likely reveal that some of those funds came from inflated charges to your projects." Vossen's face went pale. "Are you certain about this?" "The evidence is comprehensive, and I suspect the reason he's pushing so hard for me to sell the company immediately is to prevent this information from becoming public." Jesus Christ. Vossen leaned back in his chair, the implications clearly hitting him. "If this becomes public, it doesn't just damage Draymont Construction. It reflects on everyone who did business with you. Which is why I wanted to speak with you directly. I'm committed to making things right, but I need your support during the investigation process." "What are you asking for?" "Time. Don't pull the Meridian Plaza contract while I sort this out. I'll ensure that any money that was inappropriately charged gets returned, and I'll put new management systems in place to prevent future problems." Vossen was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the risks of continuing a relationship with a company under investigation against the costs of finding a new general contractor. "How long would this investigation take?" "Preliminary results within a week. Complete analysis within a month." "And you're confident you can resolve any financial irregularities?" "I'm confident I can ensure they never happen again." He nodded slowly. "All right. We'll maintain the contract for now, but I want weekly updates on your progress. And Christian, if this situation becomes a public scandal, we'll have to protect our own interests." I understand. Driving back from that meeting, I felt a mixture of relief and terror. I'd bought myself time, but I'd also committed to exposing my brother's crimes and dealing with the consequences. My phone rang as I pulled into my apartment parking lot. Jorven again. How did the meeting with Vossen go? It went fine. Fine? What does that mean? It means Meridian Plaza is staying with Draymond Construction. Silence. What did you tell him? I told him I was conducting an audit to ensure proper financial management going forward. You did what? The fury in his voice was immediate and intense. Christian, you have no idea what you're messing with. Actually, I think I have a pretty good idea. Another silence, longer this time. When Jorven spoke again, his voice was cold and measured. You're making a very serious mistake. Am I? Or am I finally doing what Dad expected me to do? Dad expected you to be reasonable, to recognize your limitations and make smart decisions. Like covering up the fact that you've been stealing from the company for 3 years? The silence that followed was complete. I could hear Jorven's breathing through the phone, but no words came. We need to talk, he said finally. Yes, we do, but this time we're going to talk honestly. Not over the phone. Meet me at the Grandstone construction site in an hour. Grandstone was one of Draymond Construction's current projects, a residential development about 20 minutes outside the city. An interesting choice for a private conversation. Why there? Because we need privacy for this discussion, and my office isn't private anymore. The threat was implicit but clear. If I'd started an investigation, nowhere associated with the company was safe for him to speak freely. I'll be there. Christian, come alone, and don't do anything else until we've talked. After he hung up, I sat in my car for several minutes, considering my options. Meeting Jorven alone at an isolated construction site wasn't exactly safe, especially now that he knew I'd discovered his embezzlement. But I also knew that this confrontation was inevitable. Sooner or later, we'd have to deal with what he'd done and what it meant for both of us. I drove toward Grandstone, knowing that whatever happened in the next few hours would determine not just the future of Draymond Construction, but whether my brother and I would ever be able to coexist in the same world again. The construction site was deserted when I arrived, just skeletal frames of houses in various stages of completion rising against the evening sky. Jorven's BMW was parked near the trailer that served as the on-site office, but I didn't see him immediately. I was walking toward the trailer when I heard footsteps behind me. Hello, Christian. I turned to find my brother emerging from behind one of the partially completed houses. In the fading light, he looked different somehow. Older, more worn down, like the weight of everything he'd been hiding had finally become visible. We need to discuss the terms of your silence, he said. And I realized that this conversation was going to be very different from any we'd ever had before. Standing in that empty construction site, facing my brother across 20 feet of scattered lumber and concrete dust, something fundamental shifted inside me. This wasn't the scared, apologetic Christian who'd spent 35 years accepting whatever scraps of respect my family threw my way. This was someone who discovered he had power, and more importantly, the will to use it. Terms of my silence, I repeated, letting the words hang in the evening air. That's an interesting way to start a negotiation, Jorven, especially considering you're the one who's been stealing. His face tightened. I prefer to think of it as securing my future, the future Dad tried to take away from me, by embezzling $2.8 million. By ensuring I'd have something left after Dad's irrational decision to leave everything to his pet project. The venom in his voice was startling. Do you really think you earned this inheritance, Christian? You think fixing bathroom tiles qualifies you to run a construction empire? For the first time in my life, his contempt didn't wound me. Instead, it crystallized my resolve. Maybe not, but apparently it qualifies me better than someone who steals from his own company. I pulled out my phone, making sure he could see the screen. I've got Mr. Kemp on speed dial. One call, and the forensic accountants get full authorization to examine every transaction you've made in the past 3 years. You wouldn't dare. Try me. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the settling creaks of unfinished houses. I watched my brother calculate odds, weigh consequences, search for the angle that would let him regain control. What do you want? He asked finally. Full confession, written documentation of every penny you took and where it went, complete cooperation with returning the stolen funds, and your resignation from Draymond Construction, effective immediately. And in return, I don't file criminal charges. You get to rebuild your life without a felony conviction." Jorven laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're not that ruthless, Christian. You don't have the stomach for destroying your own brother." "You're right," I said quietly. "6 months ago I wouldn't have. But that was before I understood what you really think of me. What you've always thought of me." I stepped closer, close enough to see the uncertainty flickering behind his anger. "Dad didn't leave me this company because he thought I was perfect. He left it to me because he knew you'd become someone who would steal from it, someone who would threaten to destroy it if you didn't get your way." Dad was a sentimental old fool who got played by his disappointment son. Dad was a businessman who recognized that integrity matters more than quarterly reports. My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it quickly. "Forensic audit team ready to begin tomorrow morning, pending final authorization." "I'm authorizing the full audit tomorrow," I told Jorven. "With or without your cooperation. But if you help me clean this up quietly, we can minimize the damage to everyone involved." "Including our family?" "What family?" The question came out harsher than I'd intended, but it was honest. "When exactly have you treated me like family, Jorven? When you've spent decades making it clear I was an embarrassment? When you tried to extort me into selling Dad's company? When you've been stealing money that should have gone to employee bonuses and equipment upgrades?" He had no answer for that. "You have until tomorrow morning to decide," I continued. "Full cooperation and confession, or I let the lawyers and accountants sort it out the hard way." I turned and walked back toward my truck, my hands surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Behind me, I heard Jorven call out, "Christian." I stopped but didn't turn around. "You have no idea what you're unleashing. This won't just hurt me. It'll destroy the family's reputation, damage the business relationships that keep Dramat Construction profitable. You'll inherit a company that no one wants to work with." I looked back at him over my shoulder. "Then I guess I'll have to build something better." The drive home felt different than any drive I'd ever taken. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't running from a confrontation or accepting someone else's definition of my worth. I was walking toward a fight I intended to win. That night, I didn't second-guess myself. I didn't wonder if I was making a mistake or being too harsh. I called Mr. Kemp and authorized the complete forensic audit. I called Caitlin and asked him to recommend the best business attorney he knew. I even called my insurance agent to make sure I had adequate coverage for the legal storm that was coming. By midnight, I'd assembled a team of professionals who would help me clean up the mess Jorven had created and transform Dramat Construction into something Dad would have been proud of. The scared, apologetic version of myself was gone. In his place was someone ready to fight for what was right. And tomorrow, the real battle would begin. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that makes everything feel sharper, more defined. I was sitting in Mr. Kemp's conference room at 8 a.m., watching 3 forensic accountants spread out documents across the mahogany table, like surgeons preparing for a complex operation. "We'll need access to all banking records, computer systems, and physical files," said Thessa Carowin, the lead investigator. "How much resistance should we expect from current management?" "Significant," I admitted. "My brother knows what you're going to find." "That actually makes our job easier. Desperate people make mistakes, leave traces they wouldn't normally leave." My phone buzzed with a text from Jorven. "We need to talk before you make this worse for everyone." I showed the message to Mr. Kemp. "He's still trying to control the narrative." "Let him come here," Kemp suggested. "Better to have this conversation on record and with witnesses." An hour later, Jorven walked into that conference room looking like a man who'd aged 5 years overnight. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, his eyes bloodshot from what had obviously been a sleepless night. But what struck me most was the absence of his characteristic arrogance. For the first time in our lives, he looked genuinely afraid. "Christian, we need to discuss this privately." "Actually, we don't." I gestured to the team of investigators already deep into their analysis. "These people are going to find everything anyway. The only question is whether you help them or make it harder on yourself." His gaze swept across the documents scattered on the table, and I saw the moment he realized the scope of what they'd uncovered in just a few hours. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "The shell companies were clever," Thessa said conversationally, not looking up from a spreadsheet. "Overlook Consulting, Meridian Management Services, Grandstone Financial, all registered to P.O. boxes, all receiving payments that were then transferred to your personal accounts." Jorven's face went white. You can't prove those companies don't provide legitimate services. Actually, we can. She turned her laptop screen toward him. None of these companies have any employees, office space, or documented work product. They exist solely to receive inflated payments from Draymond construction projects. The trap was closing, and we all knew it. Jorven, I said quietly, you can either help us clean this up, or we can let the district attorney's office handle it. Your choice. He slumped into a chair, the fight suddenly gone out of him. What do you want? Complete restitution, full confession, resignation from any role in Draymond construction, and cooperation with implementing new financial controls. And if I do all that? We handle this as a civil matter, no criminal charges. The silence stretched for several minutes while Jorven stared at the evidence of his crime spread across the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I never meant for it to go this far. But it did, I said. The question now is how we fix it. He looked up at me then, and for a moment I saw something I'd never seen before in my brother's eyes, genuine remorse. I was so angry when Dad started questioning my decisions, started looking over my shoulder. I felt like he didn't trust me after everything I'd done for the company. So you proved him right to be suspicious. I proved I was exactly what he thought I'd become. His voice cracked slightly. Someone who valued money more than integrity. The confession took 3 hours. Line by line, transaction by transaction, Jorven detailed how he'd systematically diverted funds from Draymond Construction into his personal accounts. The total came to $3.2 million, even more than Dad's investigation had uncovered. Where's the money now? Thessa asked. Most of it's still in investment accounts. I can liquidate everything and have the funds transferred back within a week. All of it? Every penny, plus interest. When we finished, Jorven signed a formal confession and resignation letter. As he prepared to leave, he stopped at the conference room door. Christian, for what it's worth, Dad was right. You're better suited for this than I ever was. Why? Because I'm not a thief? Because you still believe building something matters more than just taking from it. After he left, I sat in the quiet conference room, surrounded by evidence of my brother's betrayal and the wreckage of our family relationships. But I also felt something I'd never experienced before, the solid satisfaction of seeing justice served. What now? I asked Mr. Kemp. Now you rebuild, both the company and your family's reputation. The forensic team had uncovered not just Jorven's theft, but inefficiencies and problems throughout Draymond Construction that could be fixed with proper oversight. Dad's company was fundamentally sound. It just needed leadership that valued integrity over profit margins. That afternoon, I called Richard Vossen to update him on the investigation results and our restitution plan. His relief was audible. This actually gives me more confidence in Draymond Construction going forward, he said. You've handled a difficult situation with exactly the kind of integrity we want in our partners. By evening, I'd taken the first real steps toward becoming the leader Dad had believed I could be. The battle was won. Now came the harder task, proving I deserved the victory. 6 months later, I sat in what used to be Jorven's office, reviewing quarterly reports that told a story I never could have imagined. Draymond Construction wasn't just surviving under my leadership, it was thriving in ways that went beyond simple profit margins. Employee satisfaction was up 40%. We'd implemented profit-sharing programs, safety bonuses, and training opportunities that treated our workers like the skilled professionals they were. The Meridian Plaza project had finished 2 weeks ahead of schedule, and Richard Vossen had already contracted us for his next development. But the real transformation wasn't in the numbers, it was in how we did business. The knock on my office door interrupted my thoughts. Come in. Kalen entered, wearing the kind of smile that meant he had news worth sharing. Christian, you need to see this. He handed me a letter from the Regional Construction Association. Draymond Construction had been nominated for their Ethical Business Excellence Award, recognizing companies that demonstrated outstanding integrity in their operations. 6 months ago, they were investigating us for financial irregularities, I said, staring at the letter. Now they want to give us an award for ethics. Funny how quickly things change when you actually have ethics to award. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. Saw the article in the Business Journal about your award nomination. Your father would be proud. It was the first contact I'd had from her since Jorven's confession. Not an apology for decades of dismissal, but acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, Dad had made the right choice. Jorven had moved to another state, started over with a small consulting firm. We exchanged Christmas cards now, nothing more. The $3.2 million had been fully repaid, and he'd kept his word about staying away from the family business. Some relationships couldn't be rebuilt, only accepted for what they were. The afternoon brought a meeting with a young woman named Elara Stravik, fresh out of architecture school and looking for her first job. As I reviewed her portfolio, I saw something that reminded me of my own early work: creativity constrained by self-doubt, talent dimmed by the fear of not being good enough. "Your designs show real innovation," I told her, "but you seem hesitant to push the boundaries." "I guess I'm afraid of being too different, too unconventional. My professors always said the industry values consistency over creativity." I thought about my own journey from dismissed family failure to respected business leader. Can I give you some advice? The people who tell you to stay small, to be conventional, to not rock the boat, they're usually the ones who are afraid of what you might accomplish if you stop listening to them. Her eyes lit up with understanding. "So you're saying I should trust my instincts?" "I'm saying your instincts are probably better than you think, and the right people will recognize that." As she left with a job offer and a genuine smile, I realized this was what Dad had really left me. Not just money or a company, but the opportunity to build something meaningful, to create an environment where people's worth wasn't determined by their willingness to conform, but by their ability to contribute something valuable. That evening, I drove past my old apartment, past the construction sites where I had once felt like an outsider, past the chapel where we'd buried Dad and discovered the truth about his final gift. I wasn't the same person who'd sat in that law office 6 months ago, stunned by an inheritance I'd never expected. I'd become someone who understood that true success wasn't about proving you belonged in someone else's definition of worth. It was about creating your own definition and building something that reflected your values. The scared, apologetic Christian was gone forever. In his place was someone who knew that being underestimated was just another word for having room to surprise everyone. Sometimes the greatest gift isn't getting what you always wanted. Sometimes it's discovering you were capable of something you never imagined. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.